June 5, 1944, at the airfields of southern England, the atmosphere is thick with a tension that transks the humid summer air. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, thousands of men from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions are preparing for a mission that many of their superiors secretly believe is a death sentence. For weeks, they have been confined to these camps, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, studying sand tables and aerial photographs of a coastline they have never seen. Now the time for study has ended. Around 6 p.m., General Dwight D. Eisenhower arrives at Upottery Airfield to visit the men of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He walks among them with a forced smile, hiding the crushing weight of a decision that could result in 70% casualty among these very units. He sees men with faces blackened by charcoal and linseed oil, hair cut into mohawks, and eyes that burn with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. He tells them not to worry, that the air cover will be thick, but both the general and the soldiers know that once they step into the bellies of the C-47 transport planes, they will be entirely on their own. By 8 p.m., the airfields are a hive of frantic, heavy labor. Each paratrooper is burdened with nearly 90 pounds of equipment. They carry their primary rifles, handguns, knives, grenades, landmines, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, sea rations, and a reserve parachute. Many have strapped extra gear to their legs, making it nearly impossible to walk without assistance. They waddle toward the waiting rows of Douglas C-47 Skytrains, helped up the short ladders by ground crews who look at them with a mixture of awe and pity. The roar of hundreds of Pratt & Whitney engines begins to drown out the evening birdsong. At 10 p.m., the first transport planes begin to taxi. The noise is a physical force vibrating through the tarmac and into the bones of the men strapped into their bucket seats. The planes are packed tight, the smell of high-octane fuel and nervous sweat filling the cramped cabins. At 11 p.m., the lead aircraft of the 101st Airborne, nicknamed That's All Brother, lifts off into the darkening sky. Within minutes, the air is filled with over 800 transport planes, forming a massive, invisible armada that stretches for miles. Below them, the English Channel is a churning graveyard of whitecaps, but from the air, the water looks like polished obsidian. The pilots maintain strict radio silence, flying in tight V formations to avoid detection by German radar. The men inside sit in a heavy, contemplative silence, occasionally broken by the mechanical groan of the airframe. Some try to sleep, their heads bobbing against their chest plates, while others vomit into their helmets as the turbulence from the rising storm begins to toss the heavy aircraft like toys. By 11:30 p.m., the formation reaches the assembly area over the Bill of Portland. They turn south, heading toward the Cotentin Peninsula. This is the point of no return. As they cross the coast of France, the weather, which had been predicted to hold, takes a turn for the worse. A massive, low-hanging bank of clouds looms ahead, thick as wool and stretching for miles. As the planes plunge into the mist, the tight formations shatter. Pilots, terrified of mid-air collisions in the zero-visibility conditions, veer away from one another. The carefully orchestrated plan, months in the making, begins to dissolve into chaos before a single jump light has even turned green. The tragedy of the midnight departure lies in the transition from the absolute order of the English airfields to the absolute pandemonium of the French skies. These men were the elite, the tip of the spear, and they were launched into a storm that stripped them of their leaders, their equipment, and their sense of direction. The legacy of that night is not found in the tactical success of the drops, which were largely a failure, but in the sheer, dogged resilience of the individual soldier. They were dropped into the dark, miles from their targets, surrounded by an enemy that held every advantage. Yet, the very disaster that threatened to ruin D-Day became the catalyst for a different kind of victory. The scattered nature of the jump terrified the German high command, creating an illusion of an invasion force far larger and more ubiquitous than it actually was. The airborne disaster didn't break the invasion. It forged a leg of chaotic bravery. As the planes droned toward the drop zones, the men inside were no longer just soldiers in a division. They were the first heralds of a new world jumping into the mouth of a storm to ensure that the sun would rise on a liberated Europe. Their sacrifice began in the silence of the Channel, a poignant reminder that the greatest hinge of history often turns on the courage of those willing to leap into the unknown. June 6, 1944, over the Cotentin Peninsula, the serenity of the English Channel vanished in a heartbeat. As the C-47 transport planes crossed the French coastline, they were swallowed by a thick, unexpected bank of clouds that turned the tight formations into a blind scramble for survival. In the cargo bays, thousands of paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions felt the engines roar and the airframes shudder. They were no longer flying in organized serials. They were lone ships in a sea of grey, losing sight of their wingmen and their bearings. Then, the sky exploded. At 1:15 a.m., the German anti-aircraft batteries awakened. From the ground, a lethal curtain of flak tore through the mist. Traces streaked upward in terrifying arcs of red and green, illuminating the clouds with a flickering, hellish light. Inside the vibration-filled fuselages, the sound was deafening. Shrapnel hammered against the thin aluminum skins of the planes like hail on a tin roof. For the young pilots, many of whom were seeing combat for the first time, the instinct to survive overrode their training. They pushed their throttles to the firewall, climbing, diving, and banking sharply to escape the deadly bursts of steel. This frantic maneuvering was a catastrophe for the men standing in the back. Each paratrooper carried nearly 100 pounds of gear, from rifles and ammunition to landmines and entrenching tools. When the planes lurched, men were thrown against the bulkheads or pinned to the floor by the sheer force of gravity. The jumpmasters struggled to maintain order, shouting over the twin engines and the thunder of the flak, but the carefully planned sticks were already being torn apart. Pilots, desperate to get out of the kill zone, flicked on the green jump lights while flying at speeds far exceeding the safe limit of 110 miles per hour. Others dropped their human cargo while the planes were still banking or losing altitude. By 1:45 a.m., the sky was a chaotic mess of silk and steel. Paratroopers were being cast into the void at altitudes as low as 300 feet, giving their chutes barely enough time to snap open before they hit the ground. Some were dropped so high that they drifted for miles, becoming easy targets for German machine gunners, who watched the glowing tracers illuminate the silhouettes of the falling Americans. The meticulously mapped drop zones, once the cornerstone of the invasion plan, were now irrelevant. Instead of landing in concentrated groups near strategic bridges, the soldiers were scattered across a 50-mile stretch of the French countryside. Some men splashed down into the flooded marshes of the Merderet and Douve rivers, where the weight of their equipment pulled them beneath the dark water. Others crashed through the canopy of thick hedgerows or landed in the middle of village squares crawling with German patrols. The silence that followed the roar of the planes was perhaps more terrifying than the flak itself. Soldiers found themselves alone in the dark, surrounded by the rustle of wind and the distant pop of small arms fire, with no idea where they were or where their comrades had gone. By 2 a.m., as the first frantic reports of the airborne landings reached German headquarters, it became clear that the very disaster of the scattering was becoming a source of profound psychological terror for the deferrers. Reports began flooding in of paratroopers landing everywhere. Because there was no concentrated point of attack, the German High Command could not determine where the main blow was being struck. Small groups of 3 or 4 men, strangers from different companies and even different divisions, found each other in the dark and formed ad hoc units. They cut phone lines, ambushed convoys, and seized vital bridges with a ferocity that suggested a much larger force. The chaos in the clouds had intended to break the American assault, but instead it turned the Cotentin Peninsula into a labyrinth of invisible enemies. The bravery of those scattered individuals who chose to fight rather than hide in the face of total disorientation remains one of the most remarkable displays of initiative in military history. They proved that a plan is only as good as the men tasked with carrying it out when everything goes wrong. The legacy of that night is found in the hedgerows and flooded fields where a generation of young men refused to be defeated by the dark. They transformed a tactical nightmare into a strategic triumph, proving that even when the light fails and the formation breaks, the human spirit can find its way home through the fire. This moment of extreme uncertainty was not just a hurdle to be cleared, but the very crucible that tested the resolve of the liberation force. In the scattering of the jump sticks did not ruin the invasion. It simply ensured that the battle for France would be fought by thousands of men who refused to wait for orders to do what was right. Their individual actions, disparate and uncoordinated, formed the tapestry of a victory that no general could have drawn on a map. June 6, 1944, in the flooded marshlands of the Cotentin Peninsula, the silence of the night was shattered by the frantic splashing of men struggling against the weight of their own gear. The airborne invasion, planned with surgical precision on paper, had dissolved into a nightmare of disorientation and isolation. Instead of landing on clear drop zones, thousands of paratroopers found themselves plunging into the pitch-black waters of the Merderet and Douve rivers. By 1 a.m., the sky above Normandy was filled with the erratic patterns of C-47 transport planes, many of them flying dangerously low and off course to escape the relentless German flak. Men were shoved out into the dark, some falling from as low as 300 feet, giving their parachutes barely enough time to open before they slammed into the earth or disappeared into the treacherous swamps. For those who survived the jump, the realization quickly set in that they were utterly alone in enemy territory. The confusion was not merely a byproduct of the drop. It was an environment they had to inhabit. At 2 a.m., small groups of paratroopers began to coalesce in the shadows of the Norman hedgerows. These were not the cohesive platoons that had trained together in England for months. Instead, they were what would become known as little groups of paratroopers. Men from different companies, different battalions, and even different divisions, brought together by the sheer necessity of survival. A private from the 1st might find himself taking orders from a sergeant in the 82nd, both of them clutching their M1 Garans and staring into the impenetrable darkness. They were miles from their objectives, with no radios that worked and no heavy weapons to counter the German armor they knew was lurking nearby. The mission had changed from a coordinated assault to a series of desperate, localized standoffs. By 3:15 a.m., the chaos had reached a fever pitch. In the vicinity of Sainte-Mère-Église, isolated units were engaged in sharp, unpredictable firefights that flared up and died down with terrifying speed. The Germans were just as confused as the Americans. Reports were filtering back to German command centers of paratroopers landing everywhere, creating the illusion of a much larger and more coordinated force than actually existed. This was the unintentional genius of the disaster. Because the Americans were scattered so widely, the German defers could not pinpoint a main line of resistance to counterattack. Every thicket of trees and every stone farmhouse seemed to harbor a hidden squad of American killers. The struggle behind the lines was one of pure attrition and individual grit. At 4 a.m., a group of less than 20 men found themselves holding a crucial crossroads near the village of Fauville. They had no orders, no reinforcements, and very little ammunition. Yet they understood the grim geometry of the invasion. If they did not hold this patch of dirt, the German reinforcements would reach the beaches and potentially drown the seaborne invasion in blood. Every rustle in the grass, every click of a bolt, and every distant rumble of a vehicle was a reminder of their precarious position. They fought in the shadows of the shadows, using the thick stone walls and dense vegetation of the French countryside to conduct a guerrilla war that the Wehrmacht was not prepared to fight. They were ghosts in the night, appearing to strike and then vanishing back into the hedgerows before the Germans could bring their superior numbers to bear. As the sun began to rise around 5:30 a.m., the true scale of the airborne catastrophe became visible in the grey light of dawn. The marshes were dotted with the white silk of abandoned parachutes, looking like ghosts floating on the water. Many brave men had drowned before they could ever fire a shot, weighed down by 80 pounds of equipment in just 4 feet of water. But for those who stood on solid ground, the transition from chaos to a grim, determined order was beginning. The legacy of these isolated units lies in the fact that they did not wait for the fog of war to lift. They did not wait for the colonels or the generals to find them on a map. They simply looked to the man on their left and the man on their right and decided that the mission would succeed because they refused to let it fail. The story of the airborne on D-Day is often told through the lens of grand strategy, but its heart beats in the desperate, lonely corners of Normandy where nameless soldiers held their ground against impossible odds. These men, stranded in the shadows, were the thin line between a successful liberation and a catastrophic massacre. Their courage was not born of certainty, but of the absolute absence of it. It was their willingness to fight in the dark, disconnected and abandoned, that lit the way for the liberation of a continent. We remember them not just for the ground they took, but for the terrifying isolation they lured to ensure that no soldier hitting the beaches at dawn would ever have to fight alone. Their struggle remains a testament to the power of the individual spirit when all plans fail and only character remains. June 6, 1944, in the pitch-black swamps of the Cotentin Peninsula, the grand strategic vision of the Allied High Command had dissolved into a nightmare of mud and isolation. Men who had spent months memorizing sand tables and aerial photographs found themselves plummeting into cold, chest-deep water, miles from their designated drop zones. The silence of the French countryside was shattered by the splash of heavy gear and the distant, muffled thud of anti-aircraft fire. In these first terrifying hours after 1 a.m., the success of the largest invasion in human history did not rest on the shoulders of generals, but on the instincts of scattered individuals who were effectively lost in the dark. As the sun remained hours away, the scattered paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began to realize that the formal chain of command had vanished into the marshes. Officers were missing, radios were waterlogged, and the heavy equipment bundles were buried in the silt of flooded fields. This was the birth of the LGOP, or the Little Group of Paratroopers. It is a term that has since entered the halls of military leg, describing a phenomenon where a handful of men, often from different companies or even different divisions, would find each other in the dark and decide to go to war together. By 2:15 a.m., the hedgerows were alive with the sound of small metal clickers and whispered passwords. A private from the 506th might find himself standing next to a captain from the 505th, neither of them knowing exactly where they were, but both knowing that the enemy was somewhere to the east. There was no time for formal introductions or the checking of rosters. The philosophy was simple: find a weapon, find a free, and head toward the sound of the guns. This organic reorganization was not written into any field manual, yet it became the most effective weapon the Allies possessed that night. The German commanders, sitting in their command posts at 3 a.m., were paralyzed by the sheer randomness of the American presence. Reports were filtering in from every corner of the peninsula. There were Americans at the bridges, Americans in the orchards, and Americans cutting phone lines in the middle of nowhere. Because the drop had been such a disaster, the paratroopers were everywhere and nowhere at once. To the German High Command, it looked like a massive, coordinated encirclement by tens of thousands of men. In reality, it was often just 5 or 6 shivering paratroopers with a single light machine gun, making as much noise as they possibly could to mask their small numbers. This was the rise of the disorganized soldier as a strategic asset. By 4:30 a.m., these small ad hoc units began to coalesce around vital objectives like the La Fière Bridge and the locks at La Barquette. They did not wait for orders because there was no one to give them. They relied on the basic training that had been drummed into them: seize the high ground, block the roads, and prevent the German panzers from reaching the beaches at any cost. In the absence of a plan, individual character took over. The LGOPs were a testament to the initiative of the average soldier, a quality that the rigid, top-down structure of the German army simply could not replicate or counter in the chaos. As the first grey light of dawn touched the horizon at 5 a.m., the true cost of this regrouping became apparent. The fields were littered with discarded parachutes that looked like ghosts in the mist, and the ditches held the bodies of those who had drowned before they could even draw a knife. Yet the survivors had formed a thin, jagged line of resistance that the Germans could not break. They had turned a catastrophic pilot error into a tactical advantage through a sheer, stubborn refusal to be defeated by circumstances. The story of the LGOPs serves as a profound reminder of what happens when the structures of our world collapse, and we are left with nothing but our own resolve and the stranger standing next to us. It was a victory of the human spirit over the mechanical chaos of war, proving that leadership is not always a rank on a shoulder, but a choice made in a moment of crisis. The men who gathered in those dark French ditches taught us that even when the plan fails, the mission can still be won if individuals are willing to trust one another and move forward into the unknown. Their legacy is etched into the very soil of Normandy, a permanent mark left by those who refused to stay lost and instead found the courage to save a continent. June 6, 1944, in the dense, sodden marshes of the Cotentin Peninsula, the grand design of the American airborne landings lay shattered across miles of flooded hedgerows and darkened villages. By 1 a.m., the sky was a chaotic tapestry of anti-aircraft fire and drifting silk, with thousands of paratroopers scattered so far from their inted drop zones that the original invasion maps became nearly useless. While the Allied High Command in England waited in agonizing silence for news, a transformation was occurring on the ground that no general could have scripted. The very disaster that threatened to ruin the invasion was beginning to morph into a strategic masterpiece, driven not by the clockwork of a plan, but by the relentless initiative of the individual soldier. These men, separated from their units and stripped of their heavy equipment in the jump, began to form what history would remember as little groups of paratroopers. By 2:30 a.m., the French countryside was alive with the sound of brass crickets and whispered passwords as strangers in jumpsuits coalesced into ad hoc squads. A private from the 101st might find himself following a lieutenant from the 82nd, and together they moved toward the sound of the nearest explosion. This fragmentation, initially seen as a catastrophic failure, inadvertently created a psychological nightmare for the German defers. Because Americans were appearing in woods and orchards where they were never supposed to be, the German 7th Army commanders received reports of paratrooper landings in every corner of the peninsula. At 3:15 a.m., the fog of war at German headquarters was so thick that General Erich Marx could not determine where the main Allied blow was landing. He was forced to hold his reserves in place, paralyzed by the illusion that he was being surrounded by a force of tens of thousands, rather than a few thousand scattered and determined men. While the Germans hesitated, the paratroopers began to bite into their objectives. By 4 a.m., a ragtag group of men from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment reached the outskirts of Sainte-Mère-Église. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauser, they didn't wait for reinforcements or a formal briefing. They moved with the aggression of men who knew that their isolation was their only strength. By 5 a.m., they had raised the American flag over the town square, cutting the vital communication cables to Cherbourg and securing the first liberated town in France. The tactical genius of the day was often found in these small, uncoordinated actions. At 8:30 a.m., Lieutenant Richard Winters of the 101st Airborne found himself tasked with destroying a battery of German howitzers at Brecourt Manor that was raining fire onto Utah Beach. With only 13 men, Winters executed a textbook assault that is still taught at West Point today. It wasn't a move dictated by the master plan of Operation Overlord. It was a spontaneous reaction to a deadly threat. By the time the sun was fully up at 9 a.m., the paratroopers had effectively created a chaotic screen behind the coastal defenses, preventing the Germans from launching a coherent counterattack against the seaborne forces. As the morning progressed, the struggle shifted to the narrow causeways and bridges that spanned the flooded Merderet River. At the La Fière Bridge, the fighting was so intense that it would later be described as one of the bloodiest small unit actions in the history of the United States Army. By 2 p.m., a handful of paratroopers held the narrow passage against German armor, using nothing but light weapons and sheer tenacity. They understood that if the bridge fell, the German 21st Panzer Division could sweep down and crush the men landing on the beaches. The mission was no longer about following coordinates on a map. It was about holding a strip of road because the life of the invasion depended on it. By 6 p.m., the scattered remnants of the airborne divisions had begun to link up with the infantry pushing inland from the coast. The disaster of the previous night had been redeemed by 1,000 individual acts of courage. The legacy of the airborne on D-Day is not found in the precision of the drop, but in the resilience of the human spirit when faced with total uncertainty. These men proved that when a plan evaporates, the mission lives on in the heart of the soldier who refuses to stay lost. They taught us that leadership is not a function of rank, but a choice to move forward into the unknown. Their victory was a triumph of improvisation over order, reminding us that the course of history is often decided not by the grand designs of generals, but by the grit of those who find their way in the dark. In the very chaos that was meant to destroy them became the weapon that broke the back of the Atlantic Wall. June 6, 1944, in the flooded marshes of the Cotentin Peninsula, a new kind of warfare was born from the wreckage of a shattered plan. As the first light of dawn touched the Normandy hedgerows at 5 a.m., the reality of the night's work became clear to both the hunters and the hunted. The Allied High Command had spent months meticulously mapping drop zones and timing every jump to the second. Yet by 6 a.m., their divisions were scattered across nearly 25 miles of enemy territory. On paper, it was a catastrophe. In practice, it was the beginning of for the Third Reich. We often look back at D-Day through the lens of massive armadas and grand maneuvers, but the airborne legacy tells a more intimate story. It is the story of the individual soldier who, when stripped of his unit, his officers and his orientation, refused to surrender his purpose. The confusion that gripped the German High Command in the early hours was not a result of a clever ruse, but the unintended consequence of a terrifying mistake. Because the paratroopers were everywhere they were not supposed to be, the German generals believed they were everywhere at once. By 4 a.m., reports were flooding into the headquarters of the German 7th Army, painting a picture of an invasion force that seemed to be dropping from the clouds in every corner of Normandy. This fortuitous confusion paralyzed the defense. While the German commanders waited for a clear center of gravity to emerge so they could launch their counterattacks, the scattered paratroopers were busy cutting phone lines, seizing bridges, and ambushing convoys. They were a virus in the nervous system of the Atlantic Wall. This resilience of the airborne spirit changed the way we understand military leadership. In the dark of that June morning, a private often found himself assuming the role of a captain, and a sergeant might lead a company-sized element composed of men from 3 different divisions. They did not wait for orders because there was no one to give them. They simply looked at the man to their left and the man to their right and moved toward the sound of the guns. This improvisation was the ultimate proof that the strength of an army lay in the initiative of its lowest-ranking members. They were not merely cogs in a machine, they were thinking. breathing agents of chaos who had been trained to believe that even in total isolation, the mission was paramount. Decades later, the fields of Normandy have returned to their quiet agricultural rhythms, but the echoes of that night remain etched into the stone of every village square. From the church steeple at Sainte-Mère-Église to the bridge at La Fière, the legacy of the paratrooper is one of triumph over the impossible. It serves as a reminder that history is rarely a straight line drawn by the pens of planners. It is a jagged, messy, and often frightening series of events that are bent toward a conclusion by the sheer force of human will. The men who fell through the clouds into the flooded marshes were terrified, lost, and alone, yet they chose to be the masters of their own destiny. When we reflect on the airborne disaster that almost ruined D-Day, we must recognize that the disaster was the very thing that ensured the victory. Had the drops been perfect, the German response might have been swifter and more concentrated. Instead, the American paratrooper became a phantom in the woods, a ghost in the hedgerows that the enemy could not pin down. Their legacy is not found in the perfection of their execution, but in the beauty of their resilience. They taught us that when the world falls apart and when every plan fails, the spirit of the individual remains the most powerful force on the battlefield. As the sun sets over the monuments at Brecourt Manor and the silent rows of white crosses at Colleville-sur-Mer, we are left with the profound truth that freedom was won by men who were lost in the dark, yet never lost their way. The bravery of the paratrooper was not found in the jump itself, but in what he did after he hit the ground and realized he was alone. In that moment of total uncertainty, they did not wait for the light, they became the light.